All right, let's dive in. Now, if you've got this picture in your head of the Middle Ages as some kind of fairy tale, with chivalrous knights and grand castles, well, you're going to want to stick around. We are about to completely tear that image apart and look at why this period was, no joke, one of the most brutal and difficult times you could possibly have been alive.
I mean, just listen to this. This really sets the scene, doesn't it? We're talking about an age of serial killer thugs called knights. Forget romance and honor. The reality was just raw. It was chaos, it was violence, and yeah, some seriously strange stuff was going on. So let's get right into it.
So what was life actually like for just a regular person? Well, it all kicked off with the social structure, this incredibly rigid system that basically dictated every single thing about your life.
And at the absolute center of it all was the feudal system. You can think of it like this giant, unmovable pyramid of power, and it was specifically designed to keep the people at the top, and pretty much everyone else crushed at the bottom.
And here's what that pyramid looked like. You had the king way up at the peak. Right below him, you've got your nobles and your lords, and then at the very, very bottom, you have the peasants. And this is the crucial part. This wasn't some small fringe group. This was almost everybody. We're talking 85 to 90% of the entire population.
And if that wasn't bad enough, get this. A huge number of those peasants weren't even technically free people. They were serfs. What that means is they were legally bound to the land. If a lord sold his property, the serfs were sold right along with it, just like the buildings or the livestock. You were property. The level of control was just staggering. You want to get married? You had to pay the lord a fee called a merchet. Okay, so you live your hard life, and then you die. Well, guess what? The lord could then take basically everything you owned in a death tax called the heriot. And on top of all that, you had to do something called boon work, which was just free labor for your lord whenever he felt like it.
And you can just feel the rage people had for this system in this quote from back then. Calling the lords vultures that prey upon death, worms feeding upon the corpse. It wasn't just unfair. It was seen as this ghoulish, parasitic system where the rich were literally getting rich off the deaths of the poor.
Okay, so life was oppressive. But on top of that, violence was everywhere. It wasn't just something that happened during wartime. It was a constant, terrifying part of everyday life.
I mean, even their idea of fun was absolutely lethal. Take a game called mob football. This was not a sport, okay? It was basically a structured riot. Entire towns would go to war with each other, brawling to get an inflated pig's bladder from one end of town to the other. And the only rule really was try not to actually murder your opponent. A rule that, you guessed it, got broken all the time.
So what about the knights? The heroes in shining armor who were supposed to be protecting everybody. We have this very romantic idea of them, but was that the reality?
Not even close. The reality was so much darker. As one historian puts it, the average knight was basically a hired thug. Think of them less as a hero and more like a heavy tank. Their job wasn't to save people, it was to be the muscle for their lord, which usually meant burning the villages and terrorizing the peasants of a rival lord.
And the brutality could be just unbelievable. There's this one story from 1379. A knight, Sir John Arundel, and his men, they raid a convent. They kidnap the nuns, force them onto their ship, and then when a storm hits, they decide to lighten the load. So they just threw all 60 women overboard to drown. That was the chivalry of the time.
And the numbers from the time just scream violence. In the 1340s, the university town of Oxford, a place of learning, had a homicide rate of 110 per 100,000 people. Just to give you some perspective, look at the rates today. It was a completely different world and an incredibly dangerous one.
Okay, so if the knights weren't there to protect you, surely you could count on the justice system, right? Or maybe doctors. Nope. In fact, these systems were often just as deadly as the problems they were supposed to be fixing.
So let's say you're accused of a crime. One way to prove your innocence was something called trial by ordeal. In the logic was insane. They believed that pure, clean water would reject a guilty person, making them float. So, to be found innocent, you had to sink. You had to nearly drown to prove you didn't do it. It was complete superstition.
And this is so important for context. While all this superstition was going on in Europe, other parts of the world were thriving. The Islamic world was in its golden age of science. They were building hospitals, developing pharmacology, performing advanced surgery. All that amazing knowledge from the ancient Greeks and Romans that had been lost in Europe, it was being preserved and expanded on right next door.
Meanwhile, if you needed surgery in Europe, wow, it was an absolute nightmare. Your surgeon was probably your local barber, who couldn't even read. There was no anesthetic, of course, no sterilized tools. To close a wound, they just sear it shut with a red-hot poker. And if you had headaches or epilepsy, well, they might just drill a hole in your skull to let the demons out. It's horrifying.
So, let's pull all these threads together now for our final section. We have this oppressive system, constant violence, and absolutely primitive science. It all adds up to a picture of life and death that is just unbelievably grim.
Now, people did try to fight back. There were these incredible moments of resistance. After the Black Death wiped out a huge chunk of the population, the peasants who were left had a little more leverage. And in 1381, they revolted, demanding an end to serfdom. But the system just crushed them. Their leader, a man named Wat Tyler, was killed, and they put his head on a spike on London Bridge as a message to anyone else who dared to ask for a better life.
And if there's one single number that captures everything we've been talking about, it's this one. 30. That was it. The average life expectancy. Between the famines, the diseases, the endless wars, and just the daily grind, most people never even made it to what we'd call middle age today.
The philosopher Thomas Hobbes said this later, but his famous line just perfectly describes this entire era. For the overwhelming majority of people, life was exactly that. Poor, nasty, brutish, and short. There's really no better way to put it.
So, when you think about it all, the absolute power of the lords, the constant threat of violence, the sheer horror of their medicine, it really leaves us with one final, pretty sobering question. And it's not just a historical question. It's for you. If you were dropped into that world, with those odds stacked against you, could you have survived?